Okay, guys, so this lecture is going to be talking about animal behavior. This is one of my favorite lectures. I really like to talk about why animals do what they do, how they do what they do, and the reasons why animals do the things that they do. Animals are very interesting. Evolution is a very interesting concept in the sense of the way that it makes animals behave. And it seems like sometimes that animals do things that are kind of counterintuitive for survival. And you can see that here with this example of this gazelle. He's jumping up and down in the middle of the plains. There's not a lot of cover for him. So it seems like it would be very easy for him to be eaten by a lion or something. But obviously, there's a reason why he's doing this. And that reason is going to have an evolutionary purpose, or else it wouldn't exist. And this is kind of what this lecture is going to talk about, why organisms do what they do, and the reasons behind them. So, the study of animal behavior is called ethology. And ethology is going to look at how and why animals do things. Why they do things is going to have an answer that's usually going to be rooted in some sort of evolutionary purpose, usually going to be revolving around reproduction. And the how is going to be how their muscles work, how their bodies are put together, and things like that. You have to learn as an ethologist, someone who studies animal behavior, why or how, I should say, to kind of look at behaviors from a different point of view. If you look at things straightforward in the same way that we would look at problems and solve things, the things that animals do often don't make sense. Why would you push this giant ball of dung around? It seems very silly for this little beetle here to waste all of his energy and his time to push this giant ball of dung around. So you have to kind of open your mind up and think a little bit out of the box because animals don't work exactly the same way that we do. They have different reasons for doing things, different evolutionary purposes, different environmental pressures and things. So the reasons sometimes aren't always the same as it is seems like it should be straightforward for us. This seems like it's a waste of time. Doesn't Seems very useless to push this giant ball of dung around, but obviously for this little beetle here, it has a reason for doing this. So, um, experiments that have been done to kind of figure out why animals do things and how they do things and things like that. But the very first thing that you need to answer is how an organism is doing a particular behavior. So if we want to figure out why this organism is pushing this ball of dung around, we need to first answer how he's doing it. The how is going to ultimately explain the why. How is he doing this? Well, he's using his muscles inside of his body, his exoskeleton shells, the neurons inside of his body to send nerve signals and things like that. Um, Metabolism, the food that he's eaten, things like that to power his body. And those are all going to be proximate causes, the how an organism is doing something. Without the how, there's not a why. And the why in this case is called the ultimate cause. And 99.9% of the time, there's always going to be a reason why organisms do things. That's the ultimate cause in the sense of it is adaptive for them evolutionary wise. It gives them some sort of benefit to do this. If it didn't, they wouldn't. It's that concept of why would we do something if it didn't help us out? And animals work the exact same way. Nature is very, very lazy. It always wants to take the minimum amount of effort possible to do something. So obviously, pushing this giant ball of dung around gives this organism some sort of benefit, or else it wouldn't spend all of the energy and waste of time doing this. Now, in this case, this little beetle pushing this giant ball of dung around is going to get him significantly more mates and significantly more offspring than if he was not to push this ball of dung around and just walked around on his legs, just walked around on the ground like a normal beetle without pushing this ball of dung around. So it turns out the reasons why these organisms do this, why this beetle wastes his time and energy doing this, is because female dung beetles find giant dung balls very attractive. Now, as this male, you have shown the female that you are able to build a giant dung ball. It takes a lot of energy to be able to do this. And not only are you able to build one, you are able to push it around in the environment, which takes a lot of energy. And you're also able to avoid predators having to look down. You can see this is his head over here. You can't see where he's going. He's walking backwards, having to walk backwards and push this giant, obvious ball of dung around very slowly in the environment, which seemingly should attract lots of bugs and birds and things which want to eat you. Lots of predators. So the bigger the ball, the more energy and the more likely you are to get eaten. So the bigger the ball, the more fit this male is. So the female dung beetles will fly around. They will see the big giant balls of dung being pushed around. And the males with the bigger dung balls have shown that they are stronger, better, faster than the males with the smaller dung balls. So the females will come down, they will mate with him, ignore the rest of them. The females will lay their eggs inside of this dung ball, and the male will continue to push it around. Now, this giant dung ball provides food for the offspring larvae when they hatch, the little beetle larvae. So another plus for having a giant dung ball is you can support more babies. So more babies that you can support, more babies that you make, which means you are more likely to pass on more of your genes, more offspring for you, which is the whole point of evolution, to pass your genes on. That's what drives animals. That's what drives life on Earth, the desire to push their genes and pass their genes on to the next generation. So having the energy waste, the likelihood of being exposed to predators, and all of the stuff that comes with pushing this giant dung ball around in the environment obviously gives this beetle a plus in the sense of he will have way more offspring than if he was to just not push a dung ball around at all. He might not have any offspring, and that blows the point of evolution, and that would be a total waste. So this behavior exists. It seems counterintuitive, but it exists, obviously, because it's adaptive. And for this species, it gives them a benefit, and so that's why they continue to do it, and that's why evolution continues to allow these things to exist. If it didn't have a benefit, evolution would get rid of it. It's too wasteful, it takes too much energy, there's no reason to have this thing around, so evolution would get rid of it. So there's a couple of things down here you can look at, different organisms and the behaviors that they do, and the hows and the whys. So fruit flies dance when they mate. It's a very intricate dance that the male will initiate by tapping at the feet of the female. And once that little behavior started, with the how of them moving the muscles and things like that, it will continue, obviously, because it's beneficial for the male to dance with the female and the female to dance with the male, because it shows that they're the same species. He's a good dancer, she's a good dancer, which shows that they're both strong, and things like that. So you can read these if you'd like, and get a little more information about the proximate and ultimate causes for organisms and the behaviors behind why and how those organisms are doing those things. So you're probably familiar with this concept as well. If you've ever had a dog, or if you've ever raised a small child, some things they know how to do, and some things you have to teach them. So in some ways, we are very similar to animals. We're just very smart animals, but we have all of the same instincts that they do. Things that are innately wired into us. Things like breathing, things like how to eat, how to drink, how to essentially learn to walk, kind of thing. You don't really have to be taught to do those things. So those are considered innate behaviors. Something that you're kind of born, and genetically it's programmed into you. Your dog knows how to run around, how to eat, how to bark, how to howl, without ever having to be taught how to do that. They just learn that. Now in humans, walking, drinking, eating, things like that are innate behaviors that are just kind of hardwired into humans, hardwired into our species, that we just know how to do. Now, on the other hand, learned behaviors are things that you have to have previous experience doing, that you have to be taught, and then you have to practice to get better at over time. So you're probably familiar with these with your animals. If you've ever taught dogs how to fetch, or how to sit, or do tricks like speak and things like that, or if you've ever taught horses different how to have saddles or work with bits and bridles and things. You have to teach them how to do that. That's not a natural behavior for those types of organisms. They can learn to do it, It takes a little bit of previous experience, but it's not something that's hardwired into them. Now, in us, a learned behavior would be something like speaking, playing an instrument, driving, things like that. If language was an innate behavior in humans, we would all speak the same language. It's a learned behaviors, which is why there are multiple different languages across the globe that different people speak and things like that. So sometimes we have innate things wired into us that you don't really have control over. But those types of behaviors are called reflexes. And you're familiar with the reflex and things. If you've ever felt pain or intense heat and things like that, you instantaneously jerk your arm away from this heat source. If you've ever gotten steam on your arm or your leg or something like that, it burns severely. So you just yank your arm away from that particular source of pain without any thought in it whatsoever. This is an innate behavior. It's a different type of innate behavior in the sense of you don't have to enhance this one. It is just pre-wired into you, and you can't control this one. You can kind of stop your breathing. If you think about it, you can stop blinking and things if you want to. But you're going to have a hard time to stop the reflex of yanking your hand off of this hot stove if you put it there, because it's just such a strong innate response. Your body doesn't want to feel pain, doesn't want to be damaged, so it's going to scream with everything inside of you to take your arm away, and it's probably going to force you to do it without your consent, without you even acknowledging that it's happening. And that's a reflex, something that just instantaneously happens, that you have no control over that type of behavior. And those are evolutionarily useful, because once again, they prevent you from leaning down on this and not realizing it's hot, and then instantaneously your hand would be jerked away, and it just takes care of that for you. You don't have to worry about getting hurt. Obviously, there would be an evolutionary benefit to having these things exist to keep you from getting burned, to keep you from getting hurt, and things like that. So you don't have control over reflexes. They are another form of an innate behavior. So another example of innate behaviors are something called fixed action patterns. Now, fixed action patterns in animals are things that tend to be triggered by some sort of visual or chemical response. Now, this example talks about male stickleback fish. Now they have this male over here. And you can see he has this red belly, and during breeding season, this red belly gets enhanced. It becomes very bright red, and that's how males show that they're ready to mate. It's also how they show other males that, hey, I'm a big, strong male, you want to leave me alone. So during the non-breeding season, they go back to gray, and they tend to leave each other alone. But anyway, during the breeding season, if a male sees another male fish with a bright red belly, that bright red belly, the male is going to trigger a response deep inside of this organism's brain. It's hardwired inside of him. He cannot control this. And once he sees that bright red belly on the other fish, he will instantaneously go into posturing. He's going to throw up the stickles on his back to defend against being eaten. He's going to start throwing his fins up and flitting around in the water to try to show the other male that he's a stronger fish. This is my territory. Hey, you need to back down. This is my lady. You need to go away, kind of thing. And if the male doesn't get that, the other male doesn't get the message, they will fight. And hopefully the one male will drive off the other one to defend his mates. Well, anyway, this is such an innately hardwired behavior in these types of organisms that it doesn't even have to be a fish to trigger it. You can show them a red picture or some sort of fish-shaped thing that has a red stomach on it, and that will trigger these males to go crazy. It's going to trigger them to go into that instantaneous, you're going to steal my mates, I'm going to kill you, get away response. Now, if you get rid of the if you get rid of the red stomach, you can give them a 100% accurate representation of a male stickleback fish. It just doesn't have the red on it, and the males will totally ignore it. You literally can take a wooden spoon, paint part of it red, and stick it in the water, and the male will become aggressive after it. You take a perfectly accurate model without the red, and the male totally ignores it. It's such an innately hardwired response that it doesn't have to even be their own species or anything even living. It just has to look somewhat similar to what they interpret as a threat, and they will go into this mode. Now, the weird thing about it is that you could take these models away once these males have started that, and it will continue. This male will continue to be aggressive for 15, 20, 30 more seconds until this fixed action, this response plays itself out. Once it's triggered, it's going to continue and play itself out from point A to point B, regardless of if the stimulus is removed. The male could leave, the other male fish can leave, and the original male will still continue to posture aggressively until he's done with his innate hardwired behavior. It takes about 30 or 45 seconds. Now, a couple of different versions of these, if you've ever had a betta fish in your house, and you've ever shown him a mirror or a drawing of a fish or something like that that looks somewhat similar, they undergo that same thing, that posturing. They start attacking the mirror, even though it's not not even a real fish kind of thing. You can even do it with just a picture of a fish. Fruit flies do this when they start to mate. Once the male taps the female's feet, the fixed action pattern is done. They will mate. They will dance even if they don't mate. They will finish their dances. Even if they don't mate with one another, they will finish the dance kind of thing. Birds do this when they do mating dances as well. Once it's started, they will finish their dancing in a very orderly, very fixed progression from point A to point B, and it always follows the exact same steps. And if the other bird doesn't do the same steps in the same way, then they will not mate with one another. So very interesting concept with these fixed action patterns, very hardwired instinctual behaviors in organisms. So here's the other one here with the fruit flies kind of thing. And learned behaviors, on the other hand, of innate behaviors. Innate behaviors hardwired in. You are not going to change these. These are things that you have no control over. Learned behaviors, on the other hand, are altered based on experience. Now you can see over here, this is a guy swimming with his ducks. This is Nico Tindenberger. He's a very, very, very famous ethologist. He's kind of the guy that wrote the book on ethology. And one of his famous experiments, or things that he loved to work with, were birds. He genuinely liked birds. And birds are very interesting in the way that they work. Birds learn within about the first 15 to 20 seconds hatching after the egg. It's actually more like a couple of hours, what species they are. And they do something which we'll talk about in a second, a type of learning called imprinting. And they figure out who their parents are, what species they are, and that's what they think they are. So these ducks have learned that Nico Tindenberger is their parent, is their mother. Whereas if they had actually been reared by their own parents, they would have learned that they are ducks and not a human. Now, in these organisms, and in most organisms, you have to learn what type of species you are. That's not an innate behavior. You know what to do, to eat, to drink, to things like that, but you don't know what species you are, and you have to kind of learn that, and that's kind of odd. Now, these are the different types of learning and learned behaviors, different types of ways that organisms can learn things. So imprinting. Now, this is the example of the birds. Imprinting has to take place during something called a sensitive time period. Sensitive time periods occur during an organism's life when their brain is very flexible. It's going to be growing quite rapidly. Lots of connections are going to be formed. And if a certain behavior or a certain experience does not take place during that organism's life when it should, during that sensitive time period, that organism will more than likely be unable or have a very difficult time in learning that particular behavior. So you can see over here at the sensitive time period for ducks, for them to learn what species they are, is within about a day or two after they hatch. So anything that they see for a repetitive period of time, or that feeds them and takes care of them within that first day or two of their life, they will imprint on and learn is their parent. So these ducks have learned that this guy, Nico Tindenberger, is their parent. And since they learned that during that sensitive time period, they didn't learn they were ducks, it will be very difficult for these ducks to learn that they are ducks. They learned during their sensitive time period that they are a human and not a duck. So it's going to be very difficult for them to teach, for them to learn to be ducks again. Now, they know how to do all the duck behaviors, as in eating, swimming around, and stuff like that. But when it comes to mating, they don't really understand how to interact with ducks. They don't really have attraction to ducks. They don't understand that they are ducks, kind of thing. They don't. They think they're humans. That's who they learned who they are. Now you can see down here. Sometimes the goal is to introduce organisms back to the wild. This is a condor. Condors are very, very endangered, California condors. So we raise them in captivity and we release them back into the wild. Now, if we were to raise this organism by hand, if we were to show it a human, giving it a pair of forceps to drop food in his mouth and things like that, he wouldn't learn that he was a human. So we imprint this little condor baby using a glove. We feed it, we never show it a human. We have a condor mother glove, a puppet, that they put food in the beak and they feed it using a condor glove. They stroke it, they stroke the feathers with the puppet. They preen the puppet with the baby with the puppet. So the baby will learn to associate that it is a condor and what behaviors that a mother condor would do instead of learning that it's a human. So if this little baby was released into the wild thinking that it was a human, it wouldn't see humans as threats. It would probably come into human areas and humans' activities and things like that. It might be shot or hit by a car. But in this way, it's learned that it's a condor. It will find condor as a mate. It will find female or male condors as a suitable mate. It will see them as a mate. Whereas in the other way around, it would see a human as a mate and would have a very difficult time being released into the wild. So imprinting in humans, a good way to look at this one is learning a language. Sensitive time periods, if you don't learn a language or how to talk during that sensitive time period, it is very difficult to learn how to do that later on in life. If you don't learn, your primary language is usually the main language that people speak for the majority of their life. It's very difficult to learn another language later on in your life. 3 to 5, 6 and things around there is about the sensitive period for learning languages in humans. The language that you learn during that time period tends to be the one that you speak the easiest. Other countries teach multiple languages during that time period, so children are often bilingual or trilingual and have a very easy time learning languages, whereas adults do not because their brain is still in that sensitive period for learning languages. Another type of learning is learning how to not respond to something. And this is something that you might not think about, but if you've ever had a hunting dog, you know exactly what I'm talking about. They're scared to death of gunshots the very first time that they hear one. Now you can see over here cowboys running around in the Wild West and things, or in the Wild West shows that they have nowadays. They shoot guns off the back of their horses. Horses are naturally terrified of loud noises, especially ones that go off near their head. It's not a natural behavior for these guys. Gunshots are not a natural sound for dogs either. Being around fire, horses are terrified of fire. Running into war with soldiers and things like that on horseback. Horses don't naturally do that. So you can habituate an animal, an organism, which is teaching them how to not respond to a behavior or a stimuli. So in this case, what they do is when this horse very first encounters a gunshot, they see that gunshot as a threat. That horse will be terrified of that gunshot. It doesn't know what it is. It will instantaneously go, oh my gosh, I'm going to feel pain. This is a good threat to me. But as the person continues to fire guns around that horse and the horse goes, oh, that's scary. I'm not hurt. Oh, that's still scary, but I'm still not hurt. And over time, that horse will learn to associate that gunshots, even though they're loud, even though they're unexpected, even though they're scary, he's not going to feel any pain. He's not going to have anything hurt him. Nothing is going to happen to this horse at all. So there's no reason to freak out around gunshots. So go ahead and shoot off my back. It's not going to bother me at all. I know that it's not going to cause any pain to me, so I don't need to worry about it. And that's the concept of habituation, learning how to not respond to something. Now, dogs, you do the same concept with hunting dogs. You can have, in humans, if you've ever lived near a railroad track, or if you live in a city when loud sirens and things go by at night, You eventually don't hear the sirens or you don't hear the train go by at 2 o'clock in the morning because you become habituated to it. You learn not to respond to that. Now, it's an innate behavior that you would respond to a gunshot. That's normal, it's scary, it's terrifying. But you can learn to overrule that innate behavior by learning that it's not a threat. Now, another type of learning in organisms and humans as well. This is psychology in animals is very similar to psychology in humans. A lot of the same behaviors are powered by the same reactions and same reasons: food, mating, things like that, making ourselves feel more comfortable, and things like that. So animals work a lot in the same way, very similar to the same way that we do. In the same way, reasons that we do things are very similar as well. Well, anyway, associative learning is a type of learning where organisms learn to associate one thing with another thing. Now, classical conditioning is a very typical form of associative learning, and operant conditioning is a little more new and slightly more different. That's a little less familiar to people. Now, classical conditioning you've probably heard of if you've ever heard of Pavlov's dog. So I'll start with classical and I'll go back to operant in just a second. So classical conditioning is learning to associate something that you can't control with something that is just happens to happen. So in this case, let me kind of see if I can respond to this a little better. So if you show a dog food, he's naturally going to start to drool and to start to desire that food. Now, that's a normal response. That is something that we would expect to see. That's normal. Now, if we take a whistle and blow it in front of a dog that's never seen a whistle, that hasn't been trained to a whistle, that whistle doesn't mean anything to that dog. Now, that dog's just going to kind of sit there and stare at you or maybe be scared of that whistle. Now, what classical conditioning does is it teaches animals that one thing leads to another. And then what can happen is you can remove that one thing and still get the desired response. This is how animals learn tricks, kind of thing. So you show your animal some food and you blow a whistle. They learn that over time, that every time they hear a whistle, they're going to get food. And then what happens is you could eventually stop giving them food and just blow a whistle, and your dog will start to salivate, start to show the expressions of food. And this is a conditioned animal. You have conditioned this animal to associate something that he once, at one point in time, didn't think anything about a sound of a whistle with food. You have conditioned him to think a whistle is going to mean food. So every time he hears a whistle, he's going to give you the same response that he would give you if you just gave him food in the first place. So this is classical conditioning, teaching an organism that one thing that at one point in time didn't mean anything now means something. So interesting type of conditioning here. Now, operant conditioning. Better way. This is actually how animals learn tricks. I should say. This is learning to associate. If you do something, I'm going to give you something, and that's if you do something good, you're going to get a treat. And if you do something bad, you're going to get a punishment. And this is very an easy one to understand for children. If they do something good, like you clean your room, I'm going to give you a treat, which leads over time to learning the good behavior leads to good rewards, kind of thing. Now, in animals, you can teach your dog that if he barks on command, if you look at him and say sit, every time you say sit, if he sits down, you give him a treat. He learns that the word sit means treat. He doesn't really know what he's doing. He just knows that if he does what you want him to do, he's going to get a treat. And that's all that matters. They learn that if they do something, more likely that when they do it, they're going to get a treat. And if they don't do it, they're probably going to not get a treat, and they might get some punishment because of that. So you teach your animal to do something and to get a treat, or to not do something and to get punishment. So in operant condition or classical conditioning, they don't have to do anything. You just teach them that one thing leads to another, and that they don't have to do anything for that to happen. Whistles lead to drooling. This organism doesn't have to do anything. Now, in operant conditioning, you teach them if they do something that's good, they get a treat. If they do something that's bad, they probably get punishment. So this organism learns over time that by doing something good, they will get treats, and that's how you teach them to do behaviors that you like. So this is teaching your dog to play fetch, to sit, to speak, things like that. So animals, humans are very prone to this, as well as lots of primates and things like that, do something called observational learning. And this is exactly what it sounds like. This is monkey see, monkey do. We sit and we watch others of our own species do things, because the older organisms in our own species have shown that they obviously are capable of surviving well enough in our world to become successful versions of adults. And if we watch them do things, we, as unsuccessful small juvenile versions of our species, will hopefully learn how to do those same behaviors that allowed them to be successful. And we can do them ourselves, kind of thing. We learn from watching other successful organisms. Now, this concept is a little more applicable to animals, in the sense of watching chimpanzees and things like that, watching them learn how to use tools. Little tiny chimps, baby chimps, take up to 5 or 10 years to successfully learn through watching how to use tools. They can't communicate with one another and say, hey, you're holding it wrong. Stick it in this way, not that way. They simply have to watch and see how to do things simply by watching. Very useful way of learning things. Whales, dolphins, and things learn by watching other older versions of their own species hunt and things, and that's how they learn to do behaviors that are crucial for them to survive as adults. Now, some animals are capable of something called cognition. And cognition is the ability to kind of solve complex problems, to kind of think outside of the box. To use all of the information that you've learned through observational learning, through conditional learning, all of the information that you've learned, and kind of put all that information into one use, focus on one task, and to kind of solve your way through a very complex problem. Now, you can teach birds to use, to spell, to add. They can associate different letters with different sounds. They can learn over 250 different symbols and words and things. So they have a very different way of processing information than we think they do. In fact, it's estimated that parrots, this African gray here, has about the intelligence of an average 2 to 3 year old child. So very, very, very smart, very good at problem solving for these types of organisms. So animals can also learn their environments. And learning your environment is a very interesting way to navigate around your environment. Now, learning your environment tends to be reserved for organisms that are not particularly intelligent in the sense that we think of them. They learn to associate landmarks in their environment. Tends to be a lot of bugs, a lot of insects, and things like that. They tend to associate landmarks in their environment with a particular place, and this is how bees and things know how to go back to good to good pollen fields, to get good nectar and things like that, or how wasps remember where the opening to their nest are in the ground and things like that. Big giant flat field seems like it would be very hard, especially for a little tiny wasp, to remember where his nest is in that little tiny hole in that giant field. So essentially what this guy, Nico Tinneberger, talked about him again, what he did to show how these types of spatial learning worked is he took a wasp and he lined their nest opening with pine cones, a little circle of pine cones. And these wasps learned to associate that this circle of pine cones meant their nest was right in the middle of it. And then all he had to do was take this circle of pine cones and move it to a different location, and all the wasps would still fly to that circle of pine cones and try to go in the middle of it to their nest. They had no earthly idea where their nest was. They just knew where the circle of pine cones was their nest. So learning by landmarks is not the most reliable way to navigate your environment. But if you're an animal, an organism that's not capable of very high cognition levels, not very capable of high complex thought, just forming a memorized image of where something is based on these things around you is a very useful way to get around and to learn your environment. So lots of other organisms, us included, lots of social organisms have social learning. They learn through being around other organisms in their own kind. Once again, this is a little bit of observational learning, but this is learning in the sense of multiple groups. Or sorry, not multiple groups, multiple organisms, not just watching one. Learning where your place as an organism falls within the civilization or society that you live in. So if you've ever had chickens or anything like that, you know they have a pecking order. And most organisms do. They have some sort of society with an alpha male, a beta male, and things like that. Some things like meerkats and different types of species of monkeys and things. They have different ranks where they have people or monkeys and things that are meerkats that are meant to watch and be guardians to alarm call for predators. Things, different monkeys that guard the babies and stuff like that, take care of the young. So, watching and learning your place within that society teaches these young organisms how to become functional adults, how to interact with those above you, how to interact with those below you in the social structure, and things like that. So, very interesting form of learning when it comes to talking about organisms that live in large groups, learning how to where your place within that group and how to function within that group falls. So, culture. Culture is the ability for older organisms to kind of teach younger organisms how to carry on being successful individuals for that species. So, organisms that live in societies tend to have very simplistic cultures. Now, culture can be defined simply as teaching your young, if you're a chimp, how to wage or how to build tools or how to use tools. Now, chimp societies sometimes wage war with one another, and they will wage war for multiple generations, and sometimes they'll settle a truce. So that's a little bit of culture too, teaching your offspring that, hey, this group of chimps next to us is an enemy, to be fearful of them, or that, hey, they're no longer an enemy. We need to relax towards them and things like that. So being able to teach your offspring and being able to pass that type of information down can help make your species more healthy from an evolutionary basis, which is kind of the whole point of the game. We want organisms that are going to be more better suited to survive in their environment. So organisms that can explain to their offspring or teach their offspring different behaviors and things like that can help their offspring to become better suited for that environment as a whole. So sometimes there is a link or different behaviors sometimes can be determined both genetically, innately, as well as learning as well. So you have an innate behavior as well as a learned behavior all kind of in one. Now, birds are a really good example of this as well. Birds know how to sing. When a bird hatches, it knows how to sing. That is an innate behavior in birds. They know how to sing. Now, the problem here is this isn't true for every species of birds, but most of them don't know how to sing the song of their own species. They don't. Once again, it's kind of like being able to babble is just a thing in humans. We know how to make random sounds with our vocal cords, but we don't know how to talk. So birds are no different. They have to be taught the song of their own species within a sensitive time period. After they've hatched. So their parents teach them how to sing. Now they just listen to other birds sing in the environment. They listen to their parents sing. They listen to other species or other birds of their own species around them in the environment sing and things like that. And as they learn, as the more they hear that song, the more they learn it. Now, the way they figured this out is they took birds that were hatched and they removed them from their parents and they raised them all alone. That bird learned to sing, but it sang gibberish. And you can see down here, this is a sound wave interpretation of the bird's song. Now, this is a white-crowned sparrow. We have them here. It's normal song. You can see the sound waves here. This is what they're supposed to sing when they've learned how to sing their own song. But when you raise them away from their own species, they don't ever hear their own species sing. They don't know how to sing their own song. They know how to sing, but they just make up random gibberish words. Now, this bird, if he ever comes in contact with his own species, he will never be able to talk to them. He's missed his sensitive time period to learn the song of his own species. So he will continue to sing gibberish for the rest of his life, whereas he's missed that sensitive time period kind of thing. Now, birds also, this is a very interesting concept, have regional dialects that go along with this concept here. So accents exist within the bird world. Birds that live in northern Tennessee will sing a slightly different version of their song than those that live in maybe Memphis or Knoxville or southern Tennessee and things like that, far away from them. And that gets even more enhanced the farther across the country they get from one another. They sing different dialects, and the songs are more different than they are similar across the species across the globe. So the birds in Washington all sing a different song than the birds in Tennessee with a different accent. It's kind of different with the same species. Sorry, birds of the same species. It's very interesting how that works. Another reason why animals do things is because it helps them survive. That's essentially why organisms do everything they do. It's either going to help you increase your likelihood of getting a mate, which is one of the main reasons that drives evolution, or it's going to help you avoid predators. And that's another good reason to do things. If you're a little organism that's very small, it's very easy to get eaten. Especially if you're green and you stick out like a sore thumb or something like that, it should be very easy for you to be eaten. So how do you avoid getting eaten and things like that? Why do these behaviors exist? Why is an organism green where it seems like brown would be a better idea? And things like that. So why do organisms do the things they do when it doesn't evolve around reproduction? Well, if it doesn't evolve around reproduction, the reasons why organisms do things is over here. They're either going to do it to avoid predators, why they do certain behaviors. They're either going to do certain behaviors to find resources or shelter, or they're going to be looking for food. And that's essentially why organisms do the things they do, other than going to find a mate. And this is essentially what powers life on Earth: mating, or these three things right here. So, organisms, if you're green, you can look kind of like a leaf. So this organism has evolved to look like a leaf, and he will sit still for significant periods of time. It keeps him from being exposed to predators. They think he's a leaf. He sits quite still. So this type of behavior, sitting still, having this camouflage, has evolved and continues to exist because it allows this organism to better adapt and blend in with his environment, whereas if he moved around a lot and things like that, he would probably stand out and be eaten. So other organisms will posture. They've evolved eye parts and things. This moth here will show off his eyeballs to kind of scare away predators. So this little moth will keep his wings closed. A bird comes up to try to eat the moth. He'll flash those wings open real fast and show off his owl face here in the middle. And the bird will be terrified away from that owl that's fixing to eat him, and the bird will fly away. Praying mantis makes himself twice as large with those big wings out and his big pincers up and things like that to try to scare away predators and things like that. So this type of behavior evolves because organisms are trying to not get eaten, which makes perfect sense. Anything you can do to avoid being killed is going to increase your likelihood of passing your genes on. Some animals have evolved the ability to actually have some sort of chemical defense, things like venomous wasp or venomous snakes and things like that. Beetles and things have evolved different types of chemicals they can release. Spurs, very unpleasant behaviors that these organisms have evolved to kind of keep organisms from eating them, to keep them from being destroyed so they can continue to pass their genes on. Typically, animals that are poisonous tend to be quite small. They tend to be easy to kill, easy to squish. So it would make sense that these would be easy pickings for predators. So animals that are poisonous tend to not want to be eaten very often. So they tend to evolve ways to warn organisms ahead of time, hey, it's just not worth trying to eat me, because if you do try to eat me, I'm going to kill you. So just stay away from me in the first place. Just leave me alone. It's not worth trying to eat me. This poison dart frog would make a very easy meal for a bird or something like that walking around in the rainforest. He could just easily pick him up and eat him. And if this frog here didn't advertise that he was poisonous, that bird would pick him up and eat him. The frog would probably die. The bird would die. and that would be kind of pointless. So this frog has evolved the ability or the coloration to kind of preempt all that. The frog shows the bird that, hey, I'm toxic, you don't want to eat me. The bird knows that, leaves him alone, and neither of them kind of have to go through that horrible process of being eaten by the frog or dying from the bird. So these evolutionary colors evolve to kind of preempt those problems of being, because this frog, even if he doesn't die from being eaten, he probably is not going to be very happy. He might have a broken leg or two, and he might not survive at all because he is going to get chomped down on by a bird. So having these bright colorations and things kind of warn organisms to leave me alone. Things like snakes, it takes a lot of energy to make venom. You don't want to waste it unless you have to, especially because if you have to rely on venom to catch your prey, you don't want to waste your venom on trying to kill something that's trying to kill you. You would rather just keep your venom and make that thing go away and just let it know that you're a threat, kind of thing. So that's why these evolve. Some organisms evolve things called distraction displays. These are very interesting types of behaviors. Now, you're probably familiar with this bird right here. This is a killdeer. They live around here fairly often. They nest around the sides of the road and gravel and driveways and things like that. They nest on the ground. They're a type of plover, and these are other types of plovers here. Anyway, if you get too close to them, since they nest directly on the ground, the mother birds and the father birds have to have some sort of way to defend their eggs. Now, they're not very big and they're not very scary and they don't really have talons or anything like that. So what they're going to do is they're going to do this little trick here. Now, the mother bird, you can see they fake, or the father bird, whatever it is, whoever happens to be on the nest or around at the time, will fake an injury. You can see they drop down to the ground, they drop their wings, and they'll kind of squeak like they're injured and hop around and flop around like they're injured, like they're hurt. Now, if you're a fox or a cat or something walking along and you're going to see the nest, you see, oh, hey, there's some eggs. And then you start to see this thing flopping around. You go, oh, hey, look, that's much better than those eggs. That's a giant bird right there, and he's hurt. I can go catch him, no problem whatsoever. So, as a cat, you get distracted from the nest. You start following the killdeer mother. The killdeers, or the plovers, whatever they are, will run away quite quickly, and the cat will follow them. And then when the killdeer gets far enough distance away from his nest, he'll just jump up in the air and fly away. And the cat, by that point in time, is so far away from the nest that he probably has forgotten about it or won't be able to find his way back. So these types of distraction displays have evolved to help these little poor organisms that are not particularly scary to defend their nest. Very interesting type of evolutionary behavior. Now, sometimes, back to our concept here of why organisms do things they do that seem really counterintuitive here. This gazelle's jumping up in the middle of the African plains, showing off how big and strong he is to the ladies. Hey, I'm willing to jump up and down in the middle of this lion-infested prairie. I know good and well that if they come after me, I can outrun them. I'm not even worried about those lions. Mate with me. Look how impressive I am. I will give you very strong offspring. That's what you want. Mate with me. That's why they do these things. It seems very counterintuitive to jump up and down like this. You're probably going to get eaten. But he's going to get so many mates by doing this that it's going to offset the risk that's posed to him to being eaten by a lion by doing these types of behaviors. So it's worth it to him to do this, which is why these types of behaviors exist from an evolutionary standpoint. Now, some types of organisms live in groups, and when you live in a group, you can kind of disperse the labor between the members of that group, and that's very interesting. You can divide up the childbearing, or child rearing, I should say. You can have organisms that are meant to guard. These meerkats sit up all day and they watch the sky for eagles, and they watch the ground for jackals and foxes and things that are going to prey on the meerkats. And if they see something like that, they let out an alarm call and they let them know. So when you live in a large group, not only do you get defense from predators with that concept of safety in numbers, you get distribution of labor, you get an increased chances of survival simply because you don't have to rely on yourself to do everything. So living in a group has quite a few advantages than an organism that lives by itself. Now, if you live in a group, the chances are you're going to have sort of a selfish reason for living in a group. And organisms that live in large groups live in large groups because it makes their lives easier. There is a selfish reason for everything in nature for the most part. And we'll touch on that a little later in this lecture. Well, anyway, large organisms, large groups of organisms that aren't very smart, things like groups of fish, and things like large groups of starlings, little tiny small songbirds and things like that, the lower end of the intelligence on the bird spears, big flocks of birds and things like that, big flocks of bats and stuff that fly around in the air, they're ruled by something called the selfish herd hypothesis. And if you ever watch those organisms move, it's very interesting. They all kind of move as one. And how do these organisms all talk to one another? How do they know where they're going? How do they know how to all move at the same time? This is how. Now, this is the concept that drives these large flocks of these large herds of organisms. I don't want to get eaten. And the way that I don't get eaten is I try to put as many organisms between the predator that's trying to eat me and myself. So what happens is this little fish right here is doing his best to get from this position to the very middle of the herd. And he will push every fish out of the way that he can to get through the middle. Now the problem is he's doing that and all the other fish next to him are all doing it as well. So one fish turns right to get away from this shark. All the other fish have to simultaneously turn right or get crashed into and get eaten. So one fish makes a slight little movement. All the rest of the fish have to compensate instantaneously or they're all going to die. So that's why these giant herds move the way that they do. It's the concept of all the other fish trying to get away from the predator and trying to swim through the middle of all of their herd, which they can't do because there's so many of them. So all the other fish just kind of have to move out of the way at the same time, which causes these herds to move the way that they do. So organisms, when they go looking in the environment for food, they're not going to just go out and walk in the environment randomly looking for food. They tend to have a very controlled way to do this. It seems very wasteful to just walk out in the environment and randomly look for food and then randomly kind of stumble away around back. Now, ants are a good way to look at this because of the way that they communicate with pheromones. What they'll do is they send out worker ants. Now, most animals that forage for food do the same thing. They will leave wherever they're sleeping at the night or their nest or whatever it happens to be, and they'll kind of just meander around in the environment just a little bit until they find some food. Now, you don't know where you're looking for food, but it's not that big a deal to just kind of stumble around and look for it. Now, once you found that food, they're going to go straight back to their nest. It's very wasteful to just meander around and take all the time that you need. You've already found food. You want to get as much energy out of it as you can. So why would you want to waste energy just kind of rambling around to get back to your nest? So organisms, once they find that food, they tend to be very controlled on how they deal with that food from that point forward. Now, how do animals learn how to move around in the globe and where they're at? So these are some ways that organisms have evolved to move around the globe, move around their environment. Very interesting. So some organisms use a concept called piloting to move around. This is that concept of building a spatial map earlier, the wasp with the pine cones. They associate landmarks with certain directions or certain environments and things like that. And they go towards that landmark. So an organism, you can see here, us, as in this case, is the organism. We've got hikers and that big mountain. Well, how do they know where they're going? Well, they're just going to walk towards the mountain. They don't know where they're going. They don't even know what direction they're going in. They probably do, but you don't have to. As long as you walk straight towards that big old mountain, you're going in the right direction. You pick a giant landmark and you walk to it. And that's concept of piloting. Some types of birds use piloting to fly to their nest, and this is that concept of that spatial map again. Some organisms use magnetic orientation to know where they're at. They have a little compass inside of their head that tells them north, south, east, and west, up and down. This is particularly useful for organisms that live in the ground. If you live underneath the ground, there really isn't an up or a down. If you live in the water, there really isn't an up or a down. It's a 360-degree environment. You can go any way you want at any given time. So how do you know which way is up and down? Well, you have a compass. How do you know which way is left and right? Well, you have a compass. So that's how these organisms know how to navigate around underneath the ground. They don't know which way is up and which way is down without that compass. So if you and I were to build a tunnel underneath the ground, we would just start digging down, and then eventually you would kind of get lost, and you wouldn't know if you were digging up, you wouldn't know if you were digging down, left, right, you'd just be digging. These guys know which way they're digging because they have a compass in their head. Very interesting way to know how they're digging. We would have to have tools to be able to do that. Now, some organisms are capable of just knowing where they're at in the globe, and this is very interesting and probably very rare for organisms other than things like whales. Some species of birds, like albatrosses and things, can probably do this. Sea turtles can probably do this, but they just know where they're at in the environment. And they can swim from where they're born on one island in the ocean all the way across the ocean, and then know how to swim across this featureless, vast, giant ocean right back to where they came from every single year. Very interesting how they do this. So we're not totally sure how they do this as scientists. It's probably some sort of blend of piloting, knowing landmarks, navigation via compass. So it's probably just a blend of all of these things put together. But these organisms just genuinely know where they're at in the globe, and they know how to navigate the globe itself, which is very interesting. We've kind of talked a little bit about this foraging concept, where organisms are going to spend the most amount of time foraging for the least amount of energy that they can use. It takes energy to make energy, and that's no surprise. So I don't want to spend all of my time looking for food. And when I find that food, I've burned all my energy. I won't be able to get my energy back from what little food I find. So sometimes organisms evolve ways that help their chances of getting food. These behaviors would evolve, obviously, because things like this anglerfish here live in environments where food's quite difficult to find. He lives in the deep, 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 dark ocean. It's quite vast down there. He's quite small. His prey organisms are quite small. So he just sits still and tries to lure the fish in to him, his prey organisms. So he sits there, flicks this little lure up and down, looking for prey organisms to come to him. So evolutionarily, this is beneficial. He doesn't have to spend a lot of energy looking for prey. He doesn't have to spend a lot of energy swimming around and things like that, and it just comes to him. This is that concept of optimal foraging theory here. At one point in time, it's not worth walking around to get food, and sometimes it's not worth eating food because the amount of time that you're going to have to spend breaking it open or gathering it is just not worth the profit that you're going to get from it. So a good way to explain this one, this one's crabs. You can see here the size of the crab. The big crabs, the size of the mussel. The bigger the mussel, the more the meat that's inside of it. But it gets to a point, the tiny mussels, it takes the same amount of work to open a tiny mussel as it does pretty much a medium-sized mussel. But the medium-sized mussel is going to have a lot more meat in it. So why would you want to waste the time and energy opening a small mussel, then why just not open a medium-sized mussel? But the larger mussels have even more meat inside of them, but it takes even longer to open them. So it costs more energy-wise to open those size mussels. So the median here, the medium-sized mussels, tends to be what crabs go for. That's that optimal foraging theory. I don't want to spend a lot of time and a lot of energy looking for food. I want to get the most return for the least amount of work. Now, crows over here, in Japan and all across the globe, they pick up things and they'll drop them, things like nuts, things like snails and little crabs and things. They'll drop them from the air onto rocks and stuff to try to break them open. Now, it turns out that there's an optimal height to this as well. It takes energy to fly up really high. So if you fly up to 40 feet, you're going to break the clam every time you drop him. But you could also break the clam every time you drop him if you fly up to 17 feet. But if you fly up to 15 feet, you've got an 80% chance of breaking the clam. And it takes a lot less energy to fly to 15 feet than 17 feet, and a whole lot less than 40. So, once again, nature goes with that bare minimum amount of work to achieve the maximum amount of profit. So once again, behaviors are only going to exist and persist in the environment, evolutionarily speaking, if they're going to benefit the organism some way, somehow, be it survivability, they blend in better, or reproductively. So, most reproductive strategies, most reproductive behaviors, and associated things like mating dances and stuff are going to fall into this concept of social behaviors, which are going to be interactions among the same species. You're going to mate with organisms within your own species, so you're going to have to learn how to interact with those organisms of your own species. So, organisms interact with their own species for multiple different reasons. And one of them is courtship here. And courtship is a very common set of behaviors that animals will go through. It's very wasteful, it seems like, to go through these elaborate courtship routines and things like that. Birds are known for their beautiful courtship displays and things like that, but most animals will do this. Why do these animals go through these silly little weird dances and jump around and run around on the water and put their heads up and bow and things like this and touch beaks in these certain ways? Why do these silly little behaviors exist? Well, they wouldn't exist, once again, if there wasn't a reason. They have to have a reason for these types of evolutionary behaviors to persist. And the first one is species identification. If you dance the same dance that I do, and you can respond to my dance moves the same way that I do, you're the same species as me. If I dance and move left, and you dance and move right, and then you jump up and down, and I'm not, chances are you're probably not the same species as me. So let's just not mate with one another. So if you can do the same dance, you do the same display, you show off the same way that I do. Most of these things are very highly species specific. You have to do the right dance moves at the right time, or else you are not the same species as me. So courtship displays help prove that you are the same species. Sometimes they can trigger hormonal changes in the participants. Some organisms, once they see this mating display or they start the dance and things like that, it will initiate the release of eggs from their ovaries and things like that, or it will increase their receptivity to mating. So these displays stimulate them to be able to become fertile. And then the last one is, how well can your mate dance? If your mate is the same as you, he dances okay. He dances the right dance. You're ready to mate, but he just doesn't dance very well. His dance was really lame. And the male right next to him has a much better dance. You're going to want to mate with the male with the better dance, because the male with the not so good dance is obviously not a very strong male. If you have babies with him, the chances of your babies dancing those same lame dances are going to be pretty high, which means your genes won't get passed on because your babies are also going to be lame. So you don't want to mate with that. So watching courtship displays, having them allows you to show off how strong you are, and things like that. Make sure that you're the right species, and to stimulate that concept in some species for being receptive to fertilization. So most of these behaviors are driven by sexual selection. We've kind of talked about this one a little bit as well. This is the concept where one of these types of organisms, the one gender will pick something that they like, and they use that as a basis for breeding. Sexual dimorphisms exist because of that sexual selection concept. The female peacock, peafowl, liked the tail of the male, so over millions of generations, the male's tail was bred significantly longer through the females picking longer and longer tails to mate with, which led to an extreme difference between the two genders from an evolutionary perspective. So sometimes you can get some extreme sexual selection that kind of runs out of hand and goes a little rampant. Now, here's called an Irish elk, kind of like a moose. They used to live on Great Britain, the UK, and across the Ireland, Irish homeland, the island of Ireland. There we go. Well, anyway, you can see this thing has giant antlers. They're huge, and they have giant antlers. Now, in Ireland, there aren't a lot of trees, so these giant antlers could get really big, and the males didn't really have to worry about getting caught up in trees and getting hung up and things like that. There also aren't a lot of predators to challenge these males, so they're not going to really have to be worrying about getting eaten. So what happened is the female Irish elks, liked these giant antlers. So they started mating with the males with the larger antlers. So males with larger antlers would have babies with larger antlers, and so on and so forth over hundreds of thousands of generations. Eventually, what happened is because there was no threat for this to stop, there was no evolutionary thing saying, hey, you need to not have these giant antlers. They're not going to get hung up on anything. There's no predators, so there's no reason not to have giant antlers. The bigger the antlers, the more mates you get. So yay, let's just make them even bigger. And that's exactly what happened. Eventually, what happened is these Irish elk, their antlers got so big that their skulls and skeletons couldn't support their antlers anymore. And the males started to die very, very, very early. They couldn't support growing these giant antlers towards the end of when these species existed, about 15 to 20,000 years ago. Their skeletons start to get very weak and very disease-ridden. They were very weak. It took so much energy to make these giant antlers that the organism didn't have enough energy to keep itself healthy. So the males started to die off. The females started to have weak offspring from these weak males. So the entire species collapsed and went extinct because of uncontrolled sexual selection. These antlers got so big because the females didn't have any reason to stop mating with males for giant antlers, because there was no reason not to from the environment, that they got so large the antlers actually killed the organism itself. So these strange traits that seem counterintuitive to evolution can very, very easily be explainable because they obviously benefit this guy getting more and more mates. But once again, there is a downside, and evolution would explain that very easily as well if evolution didn't work in the way that we understand it to. These antlers would just get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, and there would never be any reason for them to stop getting bigger. And this organism would just continuously get bigger and become 18 million feet tall. But obviously, that's not how evolution works, and I've talked about this concept before, that there are physical limits on evolution as well, by the limitations of how organisms are put together. So his bones couldn't get strong enough to support his neck. He ended up having downsides because of these giant antlers, which led to the extinction of their species as a whole. So what drives sexual selection between organisms? Well, there's two different types. You have intrasexual, which can lead to sexual selection. And this is males fighting with males. Males fighting with one another over access to females. So in this case, the bigger male is going to win. The male with the larger hump, or the male with the larger antler that was able to push the other male away. That's going to lead to larger antlers for males as well, or larger humps to be able to push with, larger tusks and things to be able to push your opponent away with, or to damage your opponent and things like that. So that's how this one works. Now, different types of mating systems also lead to different types of behaviors in animals as well. Now, if you are an animal that has external fertilization, you don't really have to worry so much about who your parents are, because you're going to have pretty much an equal chance of mating as every other one of your own species. So organisms that reproduce externally, they just have a giant cloud of sperm, giant cloud of eggs, or they release their eggs on the ground and the male comes over and releases his sperm. It's not so much a big deal for these guys to ensure paternity. But for animals that have internal fertilization, ensuring paternity is a big deal. You want to make sure that you are the father. You don't really want to waste. Now, the mother knows who her babies are because she's going to birth them. But the father, he can't guarantee that they are actually his babies, because she could easily go mate with another organism. Now, male organisms go do that all the time. Males cheat on their partners all the time. Keep in mind, these guys don't understand relationships in the same way that we do. They just function off of pre-programmed instincts. Now, the male organisms are very, very, very sexually active with other females for lots of species, whereas the females sometimes are just as sexually active with other partners, but not always. It just kind of depends. But since this is the case, For external fertilizing animals, doesn't really matter, but internal fertilizing animals, you have to ensure that you are the father. And if you help raise these offspring with this mother, you want to ensure that you are raising your own babies because you don't want to waste your time and your energy raising some other organism's offspring. So, organisms that are monogamous mating, there's one male and one female, and that's how that works. That's how these guys ensure who the father and mother are. I know who you are because you're the only one that I've been with, kind of thing. Very rare in the animal world. Some species of birds do this, most of them don't. Some of them will be monogamous in the sense of they hang out with the same partner, they raise babies with the same partner, but those babies might not be their actual babies, kind of thing. So, true monogamy in the bird world is in the animal world is a little uncommon. So, polygamy is more common in the animal world, and this is where males or one male has multiple partners, or one female has multiple partners, kind of thing. And this tends to be dominated by the males in the animal world. So you can see our stallions fighting for over the females, and our one male elk or bull elk that has access to all of his cows, kind of thing. So, different types of organisms also give different type of care to their offspring. We've talked about this concept a little bit as well. It's evolutionary beneficial to put a lot of care into your offspring because it ensures that your babies will survive into adulthood and carry on your genes. Whereas if you have a bunch of babies and you don't put any care into them whatsoever, the chances are that maybe one or two of them will survive into adulthood and pass your genes on, where the vast majority of them will die. So playing the numbers game or playing the insurance game. Different strategies have been utilized by different species throughout time. So, how do you ensure that your babies are actually yours? Well, one of them is very easy. You mate with your partner, and then you just hang around with them all day long and chase away anybody else that wants to come mate with them. That's a pretty easy one. It's my baby because I guarantee you that nobody else mated with you because I scared away everybody else. Some species of fish and some species of bugs and birds and things can insert plugs inside their partners that can actually prevent sperm from other males being inserted into them. So you can see here this is a sperm packet or a little sperm plug that's been inserted into a bug, and that contains the sperm. And the organism itself that the sperm's above that. Sorry, this prevents the sperm from being able to come back out, and this is also going to prevent more sperm from being able to go in to that female. The male will put this there after he mates. And then some species can actually scoop the sperm out of females and then put their own sperm in. But the problem is if you can scoop the sperm out, someone else's sperm out, someone else can scoop your sperm out as well too. So lots of different organisms have evolved different ways to ensure that they're actually raising their own offspring. So if you have external fertilization, you can't so you either are not going to know who the parents are and that's your mating style, like these, they just mate in one big cloud, or you're actually going to physically watch your sperm wash over the eggs if you're things like salmon or bass, and you mate by yourself. So that's pretty easy to ensure that you are the parents because you watch your sperm go over the eggs, or you just don't care. And it depends on what type of species you are. So men and in humans, men tend to have more partners than women, sexually speaking. And this is in the case for almost every organism as well. And the reason for this is females have more to lose from a bad mate choice than males. For males, if they have 15 partners and one of them happens to become one of them's not a very good selection for a mate, it doesn't really matter. He could get all 15 of those women pregnant, and he has one bad mate, one bad mother. Not a big deal as long as those other 14 mothers provide for those offspring. That one bad offspring he can provide for, or he doesn't have to provide for. He can just go somewhere else, and she's still saddled with his baby. So males have very little to lose from mating. They don't have to take care of their babies. and they don't even have to be involved in the parental process if they don't choose to be, or if their species doesn't allow them to be, it doesn't want them to be. Now, for females, on the other hand, if you could mate one time and you could pick a bad mate for that very first time that you mate and become pregnant, and you are stuck with a bad mate's baby for the rest of your life, or for 6 months, or however long it takes for you as that particular organism to raise that offspring. So females have a significantly larger consequence to choosing bad mates than males. Males don't really have much to lose. Females have a significantly larger thing to lose in the sense of time, or their the reproductive abilities and things like that than males. So females tend to have less partners than males because males have less to lose than females. So we talked a little bit about societies as well. In societies, living in groups, you have a better ability of finding food. If one organism finds food, they can bring it back and tell the rest of the group how to go find that food. So you won't starve, whereas if you lived by yourself, you'd have to find the food yourself. You can have protection from environmental conditions. You can gather together in a big, large group and huddle together from the snow and things like that. These little snow macaques in Japan here huddle together to keep each other warm. Whereas if you lived by yourself, you just have to sit out there and shiver. Protection from predators, we talked about that one as well. The meerkats here will raise the alarm if they see an owl or a hawk or an eagle or something in the sky, or a jackal or something coming on the ground. And then all the rest of the meerkats that weren't paying a bit of attention instantly know that there's a predator around, and they need to know to run away and hide. And these guys get free food from the other meerkats and a place to live in return for playing lookout all day long. So the disadvantages of living in a group. There's competition. You have to fight with people in your group for limited resources. That makes perfect sense. Limited mates. Predators can see big groups of buffalo walking through the prairie. Wolves can track you down pretty easy. And also, if this buffalo is right here is sick, it's a pretty likelihood that he's going to get everybody else sick here. Whereas if you lived by yourself or in a very small group, it would be easy to stay away from those diseases. Diseases move quite quickly through large groups. Now, how do you deal with living with different societies and reducing this fighting with different groups of organisms? Well, you establish a territory. And a territory, these are wolves, not grebes. Grebes are birds, and these are wolves. You establish a little group, a resource-rich area that's all your own. So this set of wolves here, you can see the different wolf packs. This is in Yellowstone. Have established their own little territory. This is mine. It has everything that I need in it. This is yours. That has everything you need. And you stay in yours. I'll stay in mine. Everybody stays happy and healthy. Everybody gets what they need. And this reduces fighting. Competition is bad. Fighting between different groups is bad. Fighting in any way, shape, or form is bad because it's going to cause damage to the organisms. It's going to cause loss of energy, which causes damage from an evolutionary perspective. So just establishing these territories, things that you defend, you walk around and keep other critters out of your area, allows you to have everything that you need, and it reduces that competition just by establishing these territories. So lots of different organisms establish territories that they defend from other organisms or other groups of organisms. So there are also dominance hierarchies that exist within groups, where one group has a leader, often the alpha male and the alpha female, and those groups maintain order. Those alpha individuals maintain order within that group. If a lower ranking monkey or a lower ranking dog or something gets a little uppity and wants to start fighting or start bullying, pushing his weight around, the alpha male will come in and discipline that younger organism, that fighting organism, and teach them, hey, this is not how you do this. And what that does is it nips things in the bud. The big large male comes in and whops the little male on the head and says, hey, stop that. Before the little male gets out of hand and starts to irritate everybody, and the female turns around and chokes him to death, kind of thing. So the male just puts a stop to it. Having organisms that are in charge, having a boss, reduces that competition, reduces infighting between your group. Now, Sometimes organisms living together in a group seems like that they're going to be putting themselves out there. But for one organism in that group is going to be putting themselves out there for the rest at the risk of the other ones. In our meerkat here, we have our lookout meerkat, and he seems like he's going to be putting himself at risk by watching for predators. Everybody else gets food. Everybody else is not paying attention, but this guy is sitting up on the back of his legs, standing up real tall, looking for predators all day long. This seems like something that's really friendly to do, but evolutionarily counterintuitive. Why would this meerkat risk his own life? Well, the reason here is this meerkat is benefiting the whole. This is a lot how animals work. The good for the many, good of the one is not really is better, or the good of the many is better than the good of the one kind of thing. So this meerkat, his genes are very similar to his families, his brothers, his sisters, all the rest of the groups in his family group. And as long as the group of his family continues on, his actual contribution is very little. So they are willing to kind of risk their lives a little bit to help the group as a whole, kind of thing. This is reciprocal altruism. Sometimes animals will help one another out knowing that they'll be paid back later. And we've talked about this concept as well in some of the earlier lecture series. The cleaner wrasses will come in and clean the fish. They get a clean meal, a free meal from the fish, and then the big giant fish gets cleaned of parasites and things like that. So this is why these types of behaviors exist. Both of these guys benefit. And then there's something called eusociality, which is where organisms tend to divide behaviors, divide labor between different groups, different generations of their own families. Wolves do this, African wild dogs appear to do this, woodpeckers, birds, and things do this. And there's a reason why these things exist. It's easier as a group to have kind of a babysitter up here to guard the babies while the rest of the guys go hunt and bring food home to the babysitter. Now down here, the younger males will help take care of different groups. These are the male and the female, and they'll have a young male from some random bird that lives with them that helps take care of the babies. And the reason here is why this happens is this male's not getting anything. It's a waste of his time to take care of babies, but when this male dies, he gets to mate with the female kind of thing. So he's already there. So these types of weird behaviors evolve for a reason, and they're usually going to evolve around reproduction. Ants, mole rats, and things, wolves, lots of bird species are all truly social animals. So this is all I really got for you guys over this lecture on how and why animals do things. If you have any questions at all on this, or you would like me to elaborate a little more over some things, feel free to shoot me an email. If not, have a good rest of the day.